Developing and enjoying fantasies is natural. It's part of our creative process as human beings. At some point, our childhood ability to fantasize morphs into fantasies about sex. Most people have them. Today, we're talking about women's sexual fantasies with my guest, Wendy Maltz. Why do we have sexual fantasies? What do they do for us? Is there a point where a person's fantasies can be called abnormal? Is it a good idea to share your fantasies with your lover? Wendy Maltz, welcome to Full Power Living.
Oh, so nice to be here.
Okay, so almost everybody has sexual fantasies, I believe, but because they're fantasies and because they're private, we haven't really known a lot about them, and women's fantasies, it turns out, are different from men's fantasies. So let's start there. What's the difference between men's and women's sexual fantasies?
Well, men tend to fantasize in pretty overt ways, direct ways in terms of sexual activities and sexual body parts, and, just kind of directly getting it on, And women tend to fantasize in a more sensual context and relationship context. So it matters a little more who they're relating with and what the dynamics are in the relationship, not just who's touching who where or what, and what's going on sexually. So men's fantasies also tend to be a little bit more being active, and women's are a little more passive. So it kind of reflects some of the sexual stereotyping we get. But things have been changing a little bit, as women's sexuality has opened up more. What seems to be happening is women are able to have more graphic fantasies. And I think a lot of men have some of these sensual, more emotionally based fantasies, but they may be a little bit reticent to share them because it's not what's being put out in the culture and the media.
Uh-huh. Wow. Well, we'll get into sharing sexual fantasies anyway. There's some possible positives and some possible negatives in doing that altogether.
Right. That can be an explosive area.
Right. Yeah. So there are all kinds of reasons from reading your book that women have sexual fantasies. For example, they might not have a lover and use a fantasy when they masturbate, or they want to enhance an already good sex life with their spouse or partner, or they're spicing up their vanilla sex that they're having with a partner, or they want to assure themselves of having an orgasm. And some fantasies, as I understand it, are also touched off by prior sexual abuse. Talk about some of these reasons, reasons that women have those sexual fantasies.
Yes, well, as you shared, there's quite a variety of them. Sexually fantasizing is very natural. About 95% of men and women do it. It's a way of boosting arousal and decreasing anxiety in general. That's what they do. They can kind of transport us into a space where we're kind of entranced with sexual imagery and thought, a way of dropping, what do I need to shop for, do we have enough milk and vegetables, that kinds of things, and just a way of kind of tuning in more directly to sexual ideas. And so it can keep a person kind of focused on sex, and that can help with arousal as well as having orgasms. And it can add diversity to our sexual routine. It expands the range in a kind of safe way, because if we acted out on what some of our urges are, we might get ourselves in trouble, right? But we can think them, and we can imagine them, and we can use them to increase stimulation in our real life in a way that where nobody is hurt, we're not hurt, and nobody else is hurt. So they're just very clever ways to kind of expand our sexual repertoire and increase arousal.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm thinking as you're talking that when I was growing up, there was not a lot of talk about women's sexuality, and your genitals were referred to as down there and don't touch, that sort of thing.
Right, I remember that.
and so I'm wondering if I know there have been some studies, but yours is one of the first where you really went directly to the women and got them to share the fantasies. In your learning, are women more interested in sex now than they were 50 or 100 years ago, or is it just that we're able to talk about it?
Well, I think we're able to talk about it more. I think things are a bit on a roller coaster now because there are certainly a lot of positive changes that have occurred, with the Internet and with mass communication and with development of sex education and women's studies, things like that. There's just a lot more awareness that women are sexual. In the early 1900s, it was thought that women didn't even have sexual fantasies. So we've really come a long way. But really understanding them and their uniqueness was something that hadn't been done, and there was just a dearth of research when Susie Boss and I decided to do the research we ended up doing for the book Private Thoughts. We interviewed women who were ages 19 to 66 from a whole variety of backgrounds. There were housewives, there were lesbians, there were people from different countries, and sex workers as well as virgins. And, we really wanted to find out what they were thinking when they thought of sex or became aroused. We didn't ask, tell us your sexual fantasy, because so many women, they didn't really understand what that meant. They don't, they couldn't really identify that the thoughts they were having during sex work are sexual fantasies, the things they used to get aroused. They thought they had to be the sort of things that were put out by the media, like a schoolgirl with a professor or something, or chambermaid, with the master, that sort of thing. And they didn't realize that our sexual fantasies are really whatever it is you're thinking about when you become aroused, that turns you on, and also that that you associate strongly with sex. So if it's even like galloping on a horse, that could be a sexual fantasy if it comes up, on your way to orgasm.
You're reminding me that there is a story in your book of a woman whose fantasy was riding bareback on her horse, and she got her husband involved with her and then got so sore she couldn't have sex afterwards.
Right, I know. That was so cute. The thing with fantasies is they work very well in fantasy. And then, because we can control everything in fantasy, there is no rawhide or whatever, everything can feel good. And then when you act it, if you try and act it out, you can run into just everyday realities and limitations.
It reminds me, I'd just share with you, I married at age 19 long time ago, and we honeymooned on Ocracoke Island, and I've actually written a speech about this entitled What I Learned on My Honeymoon That Helped Me in the Speaking Business. But one of, it was a beautiful day, and we stood out on the deck and whatever. We got to our little cabin, and it was hot and stuffy, and I fell asleep because I had a little bit of a sunburn, and my lovely new husband went into the bedroom and took the bed apart piece by piece and reassembled it in the living room so we could have a breeze. Then he awoke me and picked me up and carried me to the bed, and it was just like the woman with the horse. Everywhere he touched me, I hurt, and I couldn't be with him that night at all.
And that sounds like, it makes for a very nice romantic fantasy, but with the reality, that it was different. That's cute.
Well, speaking of that, if we don't have a chance to check things with others, I've been a psychotherapist for 41 years now, and I know that a lot of us people think that we have the worst problem or we have the thing that is so bad we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that, based on reading your book, that happens in the area of sexual fantasies, too.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we titled the book Private Thoughts was, because it's, our sexual fantasies tend to be women's most private thoughts. They're really scared to share them. And I think there are a lot of men who are afraid to share. There's also, sometimes, it can be easier to share something you might like to do sexually, which is hard enough to share, right? But what you're really thinking about that really turns you on can be kind of scary, because people think, oh, is it normal? Will I be laughed at? Or I'm shameful for feeling this. Like, one of the things we found out was that same-sex fantasies were not uncommon in heterosexual women. A lot of women fantasize about other women's bodies. And female bodies are a turn-on, and they're all over in our culture. And, but women who got concerned that maybe this meant they were gay, it just confused them. And being able to talk with other women and find out that was normal and not unusual and can be a celebration of femaleness. And also for lesbian women, we found out that sometimes they fantasize about men and their erections, and that's a turn-on. And there can be some women had fears that if their partners and other females found that out, that they would be negatively judged. So just to know that there's just like so much that, like anything goes with fantasies. We talk to women who are turned on by gargoyles. It wasn't just the chocolate sauce and whipped cream and things, but and there's no right or wrong with fantasies. It's just what is. It's kind of like our dreams, and we can learn from them, and they can reflect fears and conflicts, but also desires. So it's really a very individual thing what a sexual fantasy means, and it can be a way of letting off some mental stress, too, to have the particular fantasy you do. Our fantasies are also very much affected by what we see in our culture. And so sometimes, we can have disturbing fantasies because we've been exposed to disturbing material.
Yeah, I was, now you've bordered on this a little bit, but I want to go a little more deeply into it. What function, you say it helps us with fears and conflicts and mental stress, like psychologically speaking, what do our sexual fantasies really do for us? Or I guess we hope, some of the sexual fantasies don't do what we hope they'll do, or we get stuck in patterns that are not really beneficial. So psychologically speaking, what do they do for us?
Well, like I said, the range is so broad, because sometimes they can just be silly fluff. You can imagine you're having sex with the guy who delivers popsicles, in a little truck or something, and just like silly, and you notice he was cute or whatever, and like, well, what was that? Or he popped up into, an experience or whatever, and it's just like, it just actually just really means nothing. But then there are times, especially if you have like a recurrent fantasy, or you have fantasies that you need to think of in order to get aroused, those ones can have a little more meaning. And those, like with recurrent dreams, it can be helpful to look at them in therapy, or analyze them like you would a dream to try and understand. It's sort of like ask yourself, where am I in my fantasy? What are the relationship dynamics? Does this remind me of anything? What's the scenario? If this was a movie, how would it start? What would it be entitled? Where would it end up? Where is it going? What is my sexual fantasy telling me? Does this remind me of anything I experienced in real life? And you can do this kind of like looking at them more closely. The important thing is not to be afraid of your sexual fantasies, because they are rich resources for psychological growth. And I think they're as rich, if not richer, than dreams. And I think they've been really overlooked, because people have been kind of scared of them because they are sexual. But sometimes it can be like some women have discovered that their fantasies reflect unresolved feelings from early abuse or neglect or abandonment. And it's a way that they kind of, in their minds, created a metaphor or a story that encapsulates some early pain, and then by turning it into a sexual fantasy, they were able to discharge some emotional energy as they felt pleasure and release from the sexual stimulation. So, it's like, if you're disturbed by something that you're having in your sexual fantasy, just also see that it may be serving a purpose for you until you figure out what that is and find some other ways of dealing with it. It may be a way of containing some unresolved psychological issues that allows you to then function in a relationship or sexually or in your life in general without, being in a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did you follow me on that?
I did.
It's really fascinating. This is just such a fascinating area. It's not, like I said, because it can be just fluff, but it can be really serious stuff. And I've worked with women and men who've analyzed and worked through sexual fantasies that were disturbing them, and then felt like it was like they came to a sense of higher self-esteem, more confidence, a sense of being free of this emotional residue from past hurts.
I'd like to talk with you about scripted and unscripted fantasies, and then look at some of the scripted fantasies that occur. What's the difference between scripted and unscripted fantasies?
Well, one of the things that we found out in our research was that there were these two general categories of fantasies. An unscripted fantasy has more to do with a sensory style that a person has, or sensory stimulation going on. Like, what are you seeing? Are there, do your sexual fantasies involve red satin sheets, and or a really hot-looking partner, who's got a great bod? And so is it visual? Is it auditory? Do you like to have whispers and sounds or moans or screams or music that turns you on? Do your fantasies consist a lot of tactile stimulation, the kind of touch or massage or soothing or stroking that's happening that you're imagining? Or olfactory. It's another type of oral sex, I guess, Ilene. It's like oral with A-U-R. A-U-R. But it's like, where you relate to smells that are going on. And our smell sense is one of the most critical senses in our sexual relating. The scent of a lover can be actually the biggest turn on, and people who have problems with smell can sometimes have difficulty with sexual arousal. So it's greatly overlooked. And It doesn't come through an internet, over the internet or
no
the
wonder
telephone.
People have trouble with internet relationships.
Right,
sometimes.
they meet each other and they just smell wrong, the pheromones all wrong. But so do your fantasies relate to smells? Cinnamon, vanilla, and pumpkin pie spices are really known to increase arousal. And popcorn. Are they kinesthetic? Do they relate to like dancing or movement or watching somebody work out in a gym, where their bodies are undulating, or something to do with flavor and taste? And so, these unscripted ones, they can be very brief. Like one woman mentioned Denzel Washington's lips. It's just like there. It's just right there. And these can come in and to be able to validate those as fantasies. I was talking on a radio show when the book first came out with a man, and we were talking about these scripted and unscripted fantasies. And after the show, he said, "Well, I think I have those unscripted fantasies." I said, "Why didn't you say something on the show?" He said, "Well, it's not the sort of thing you talk about in the locker room, But I said, "Well, are you willing to share it?" And he goes, "Well, when I'm making love with my wife, I imagine her a diamond, and I am a ray of light shining through her and breaking into, 1,000 pieces." And I just went, "Wow, that is such a hot image, So that's a good example of that unscripted, more sensory fantasy. And sometimes those can be the most delightful. They tend to not be they give a feeling, right? It's a visceral feeling that you get from it. Whereas what we were talking about earlier in the first segment of the show about how fantasies are like dreams, and the scenarios that go on them can relate to conflicts and desires and stuff. That doesn't have that. They don't tend to have the complexity emotionally of the sensory fantasies aren't as complex emotionally. They're more like in the moment. Wow, feels good to think of that, or while you're having sex, it's like all of a sudden you imagine that you're, on a beach somewhere, and making love, or in the water, or and something that's just sensually very delightful to you. Now the scripted fantasies. What we wanted to get at, what are the relationship dynamics going on with the fantasizer and the fantasy, and the dynamics in the fantasy. So it was much more effective to ask somebody, where are you in your sexual fantasy? What are you doing? What's going on in terms of your relationship? Are you watching? Like, are you a voyeur and kind of watching other people have sex? Are you a participant? If you're a participant, is it something that, are you like the object of desire, or what we call the pretty maiden, sort of Cinderella story, and being chosen as because someone else has a lot of desire for you, or are you like a wild woman who's dancing on tabletops and doing a striptease, or going for her guy or her gal, in a direct way, initiating sex. And so, are you active or passive? And then also, is there a dynamic there in terms of like dominance and submission? Is there a power imbalance, or are there some are there hostile elements, or anger, or things like that? Because being the object of desire can kind of drop down into being a victim of someone else's aggression, and those fantasies were more rare, but we found then, like the pretty maiden, where the woman was swept away by the gorgeous partner. But those did happen, and sometimes those happened with sexual. A lot of times they were associated with early experiences of sexual abuse, unfortunately. And there was also like similarly, the kind of wild woman or going for what you want, being active in sex, can kind of drop into a dominatrix kind of role of expressing control and dominance in a relationship, and sometimes humiliating or expressing anger through sex that way. And then there's the sixth type of scripted fantasy we came up with was beloved, where the energy really is quite mutual and swirls from a common passion, two people dancing and kissing and hugging, and you can't really tell who's starting what or whatever, but they're both kind of being turned on simultaneously by each other's energy. So those were the kind of basic 6 types of fantasies that we found. Previous to this, people had categorized sexual fantasies in terms of more like, what was the sex act? Was it intercourse? Was it oral sex? Was it a threesome? Or the numbers of partners? Or was it same sex or heterosexual? Or was it incest? And they had these kind of categories, but those categories they weren't as helpful in terms of getting at what was really being experienced by the fantasizer. Because you can have a fantasy, let's say, about spanking, and it can range from, being something that really upsets you to something that's just delightful, and based on what the conditions are and who's doing what to whom and where you see yourself in the fantasy.
And how hard the blow is.
And how hard the blow is, right. So, I mean, a lot of times people like to they simplify this whole area of sexual fantasy, and they sort of simplify it right out of its meaning. Just like you can't simplify our dreams, right? You can't say, oh, you did you have dreams about your father or your mother? Well, those can be really different, from one person to another, dreaming about a particular person. I get the question a lot from people of, is it a bad thing if I fantasize about someone else while I'm having sex with my partner? And it's like, gosh, you really need to kind of look at a lot of what's going on there. Is it something that you require to do? How do you feel while you're when you do that? Does it seem to expand or enhance the sexual experience with your partner, or does it seem to detract from it? Is there unresolved grief with, let's say, the loss of a previous partner? It's just really an individual thing, and sometimes it can be just a wonderful way of, like I said, expanding the sexual experience in your partners, like represents all men or all women or whatever, and by thinking of this other person, it's like an aspect of your partner. Or it can be really like, I don't really find my partner attractive, and so I have to think of somebody else, and that would be problematic, right? Or an indicator that maybe it's time for a little sex therapy or something.
Right. One of the questions that was raised in my head as I read Private Thoughts is that if I'm a woman involving myself with fantasies at the time that I'm making love with my partner, then it keeps me from being present in the moment.
Well, it can, but it can also amplify and enhance the moment. So it's kind of like the guy. He had the fantasy of the diamond, right? And he was a ray of light going through it. Well, you can say, well, he wasn't talking to his partner while they were having sex or looking at her particularly, but he was very in tune with her while he was having that, and it increased his appreciation and experience of her, right? So fantasies don't necessarily, similarly, if you imagine you just met your partner for the first time or something, or that your partner's George Clooney, or whatever, how he was in this movie, but you're kind of weaving in and out of that, and you're relating to your partner, and that's who you love or care about or want to be with. Then it's just like if imagining you're relating to George Clooney helps you become more uninhibited or whatever with your real partner to add some spice to your real partner, then it's contributing to a more positive experience. Mm-hmm. Do you see? So it really is you have to kind of get in there and look at what exactly is going on. But if you are feeling like, oh, I have to think of George Clooney in order to, and every time where I've got this, I'm a George Clooney stalker or whatever, and then it can mean there's something psychological that needs to be looked at, mm-hmm. that he may be representing or whatever, that could give that there might be some meaning there or something that needs to come up to the surface.
Now, Wendy, I was sexually molested by more than one person as a young teen. And one of the concerns, and I've done a lot of work on it, it's not an issue for me now, but one of the concerns I had as I started reading about these scripted and unscripted fantasies was that I don't recall ever having a scripted fantasy in my life, but I had unscripted things where I would have a thought or I'd have an interest or whatever, and I learned over time to follow those thoughts and interests. So it was very comforting to me to know that unscripted was equally good to scripted, because I was going, I never had anything like that.
And were those positive for you then? Are you saying you had a thought? Or, yeah. So sounds like that created a new template that you could go to as a way of healing?
I think so. Some of the molestation that had occurred when I was very young had been people touching me through my clothes, and I know that for a long time that was a fantasy of mine, but I asked the person that I was with, I married young, I asked my husband to act that out with me, not saying it's a fantasy or anything. I think I did tell him that happened when I was molested. And once I was in charge of it, then it ceased to be any kind of an issue for me.
That's great, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the way you go about healing things like that, is by exploring them then?
It can be, yes. It kind of depends on what the fantasy is, too. That had to do with your being able to be comfortable with wanting to experience that, being touched in a particular way, not have it be forever cast in those early experiences. And so you reclaimed the ability to be touched through your clothing by replaying that. And actually that sounds that's in line with what I discuss in the book, the sexual healing journey, in terms of relearning touch, and you build new associations to touch. So acting out fantasies for the purpose of healing can be kind of tricky, especially if the fantasies involve something that relates to humiliation or being in a risky situation or harm done to the body, things like that.
Yeah, I didn't have those. Yeah.
You didn't have those kind of things, but I think and there's some controversy whether BDSM play the kink play can be healing or not for people. It may be for some people, but it also is can be a pretty risky territory for survivors of sexual abuse. To go, oh, well, I'll just act out my fantasy and that will heal me from sexual abuse. It's like, whoa, you could be setting yourself up for actually re-traumatization.
Really?
So it really depends on the person and what's going on. But there's a lot that can be done in, like, analyzing, talking it through, or writing a journal and exploring. When I'm working with someone around their sexual fantasies, I might have them talk in terms of who are the characters and what are the characters thinking. Sometimes we'll do I have a drawing board and they'll make a stick figure of the different characters in the fantasy, just really simple, and then little balloons for what they're saying to each other, what's going on. I have one woman I worked with who realized that this upsetting fantasy of being raped by a repairman. She was a lesbian woman, and having a repairman come to her home and rape her, that it was really an unresolved dynamic between her parents that was going on, with them being in sort of a love-hate relationship with each other. And once she kind of popped that, or could see through the dynamic in her fantasy, people were shouting profanities to each other and that sort of thing, And I'm going, well, who does this remind you? Oh my gosh, that's the way my parents talk with each other. And then we could talk about their relationship, and then she no longer had the unwanted sexual fantasy.
Yeah.
So it's just this. Like I said, it's a totally rich resource and a fascinating area. But I'm a survivor too, and one of the reasons I got into researching sexual fantasies and writing about them was because after I wrote the Sexual Healing Journey, I talked in there a little bit about problems with sexual fantasies, and I had all these survivors contacting me and saying, I have problems too. And I went to a conference of survivors, and I asked the audience, how many of you are troubled with unwanted sexual fantasies? And about 80% of the audience raised their hand. And I went, oh, my God, this is like the unspoken issue or whatever. It's like the abuse lives on inside us, And I myself was troubled by some unwanted fantasies of older man seducing a little girl. And so I was really curious to help I wanted to help other people as well as myself and find some techniques for changing that and creating fantasies that were more enjoyable, but maybe holding on to some of the sensory elements that were, and even a little bit the relationship dynamics that were arousing. So one of the ways I did it was I started fantasizing with having the girl be older and the guy be younger. And the girl then, another month later, I fantasized it with the girl even older and the guy even younger. And soon they were, a female who's 20 years old and a guy who's 30 years old. And no, it's not her, an older male relative. It is a guy she met, whatever, you know what I mean?
Right,
who
right. Well,
would be a positive partner for her. So I could change the dynamics, and then it just sort of went out the window,
right.
And so our fantasies are always changing over time, and we can help that process to make them into ones that don't have like a negative residue.
Great.
That goes with them.
You're reminding me, and I'm understanding something about myself. Maybe one of the reasons that I haven't had so many scripted fantasies is that I've actually lived them out. When I was 32, for example, I dated a man who was actually older than my father. He was 64 at the time, a dear friend, and I loved him dearly. But, I had the experience in real life of someone who actually was very loving, who was older. And that was very healing. You were talking about the fantasies that make you feel good and so forth. Those are usually the kind that women are drawn to want to share with a lover. And I love your discussion in Private Thoughts because you point out these are private fantasies, and when you start sharing them with other people, it doesn't always turn out the way you think it's going to.
Mm-hmm. Once you share it, you can't take it back, and it's no longer private. And so this is a pretty it's like proceed with caution in terms of talking about them, and also in terms of certainly in terms of acting them out, because that's even more risky territory. But I think one thing that could be really helpful is if both people in a relationship learn about fantasy, and they learn that it's what I call polymorphous libidinal thought. It's many-formed, just comes up from our natural sexual energy, and it just spills out. And it's like dreams, you can wake up the next day and go, oh, my God, what did I dream? It's like it was wild. And our fantasies can be like that, too, and we shouldn't condemn ourselves for anything that bubbles up. It's more like, hey, if you want to look at it, you can look at it. If you don't. But when people understand that in a relationship, that people have a lot of different sexual feelings, and that when someone has a sexual fantasy, it doesn't necessarily mean they want to act it out or act it out in the way that it's fantasized. Someone might have fantasies of, let's say, having their hands bound together over their head, but not actually want their partner to bind their hands over their head, right? Might just get off a little bit if their partner just gently held their hands over their head. Do you see what I mean? So it's like not to take it literally the way it comes up in the fantasy, and partners can easily get jealous. They can jump right away to let's act it out instead of like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about your fantasy, So you want, in the book I talk about go slowly and in steps. Share a little bit, test the waters, get some common understandings about what sexual fantasy is, how it operates, what it means. If you're going to talk, be kind of like curious and playful. As a partner, be very sensitive to what you hear. Don't jump to conclusions. Find out more what the fantasizer is thinking about it and what it means to them. Look for sensual clues, like what are some of these sensual elements that are going on, because chances are those are very meaningful. Is there rock music going on, And if so, that can be an indicator. Rock music might, be something that could spice up your sex life. Something like that. It's like, what can you pull from the fantasy? How can you mine the fantasy for things that, if the fantasizer wants to, that would work in, add a little spice to real life, but not assume that it's got to look like the fantasy. People will fantasize about threesomes, and it's hard enough for two people in a relationship to figure out how each are feeling and what's going on. Three people in a bed, it's like and the feelings afterwards, and watching two people do this and two people do that, and the person left out or whatever, what everything's going on. It can be very complicated, but in fantasy, it can increase stimulation. If you're a heterosexual female and you dream of being with, if you fantasize about being with two men, you've got two penises, and it can double the pleasure, double the fun, in fantasy. But in reality, it's like, oh my God, are you kidding? I can barely handle one or whatever. And so like I said, it's to be aware of those differences. What works in fantasy may not work, and just because you fantasize it, you may be fantasizing it because it increases and amplifies things, not because you really need to do that or want to do that or that would work to do that.
You went over the guidelines, and I want to say what a pleasure it is to read Private Thoughts. It's both erotic and scientific at the same time. And you guys have done a really great job.
Thank you. That's great. It was a fun book to work on and to write, and we've gotten really great feedback for it.
Yes. And I want to emphasize, too, that you've recently put it into ebook format, and so it's very attainable and reasonable in cost. But to sum up the conversation we've had today, Wendy, now check me if I've got this right. Number one, almost everybody has sexual fantasies of some kind, and they're normal. And those sexual fantasies, number two, can enhance or detract from lovemaking and sex for us, and we need to look at them and see that they're working well for us. If they detract from lovemaking and sex, we should get help to change them.
Yeah, don't be afraid of them. Just look closer to heal, and getting help can be helpful in that process, like you would a nightmare that's bothering you.
Right, good. So if our sexual fantasies enhance lovemaking and sex, go ahead and enjoy them. Also, if you're in a solid, supportive relationship, you might want to share your fantasies, but as you've pointed out, you have to use discretion and offer them playfully. And I like that in the book you point out that those people who are in solid, caring, long-term relationships seem to be more successful in sharing their fantasies. And you might also want to act them out, but you want to remember that once you've exposed the fantasy, it's not your fantasy anymore, and it might not work for you as it has in the past. And finally, that sometimes sexual fantasies are an attempt to help you deal with prior violations and abuse, and you can work with them and with the etiology of the fantasies just as you do with dreams, so that you can find out what message your fantasy is attempting to give you, and you can use that for healing.
That's a great summary, Ilene.
Thank you. I'll send it to you. No. Kind of looking at it, you're very clear, really, in the way you've got your book laid out. So is there anything else that you'd like people to take from this show?
I think basically, even though we talked about that there can be the negative experiences with fantasies, to know in general they are really positive for us to have, that we need them. They're part of who we are naturally. Sex is composed of both friction and fantasies, as Helen Singer Kaplan said, and Lonnie Barbach said sexual fantasies are vibrators of the mind. I mean, they're just delightful in this way, and to not be afraid of them, and to not condemn yourself for anything. Approach with compassion and positivity with them, and it's just a rich natural resource, and they're part of our humanity too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking such a deep look at this topic, and one that hasn't been very well explored, and I really appreciate you helping women to understand and befriend their sexual fantasies, as well as normalizing all of this for us. Wendy Maltz, thank you so much for being with us on Full Power Living today.
Great. It's wonderful to be here, and everybody enjoy.
Yeah, for sure. So I remind you that Wendy Maltz's book, Private Thoughts, is available in ebook and in paperback formats. You can visit her website at healthysex.com.